They're people who build teams that outperform the other people for a long period of time. Not popular always, but more effective. Well, one of the things that we've learned about that is effective leaders, the gap between their self-concept and their public reputation tends to be narrow. So if there was nothing else accomplished in a coaching engagement but to reduce that gap, I take considerable satisfaction in that.
Welcome to Leadership, the Secret Sauce, the podcast where we talk to extraordinary coaches and leaders to dive into the realms of leadership and coaching. We're your hosts, Dave Lipsky and Matt Dodson. So let's jump in with another guest and find out their answer to the question, what is your secret sauce? Welcome to Leadership, the Secret Sauce with coaches Dave Lipsky and Matt Dodson. Before we begin, a quick shout out to our forever sponsor, Character Matters Coaching and Consulting, where they believe that your character is the compass guiding you through life's journey. Whether you're facing personal or professional challenges, they are dedicated to helping you discover and strengthen the core values that define who you are. Dave, what do we have today?
I am excited to welcome Ed to the show. And Ed, Matt and I created this podcast mostly because we want to hang out with coaches and learn a little more about what they do and why they do it. So welcome to the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
You're absolutely. And we like to start out with an energy check-in, kind of like the way we do coaching. On a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high, what's your energy level at the present moment?
8.
8. All right. What has you as an 8 this morning, Ed? Are you a morning person?
I'm actually not a morning person, but I did get up early this morning and I rode 5,000 meters. And that energizes my whole body. And I'll probably have to take a nap about noon.
You inspire me. I have to get the bike out. Matt, what's your energy level?
I'm ready to take a nap. No, I'm just kidding. I would go with an 8. Like probably 8 1/4.
8 1/4. And I'm saying I'm going to go with 9. Only, my competitive spirit. I just want to have, I have pretty high energy. I got some good sleep and woke up early to start doing some work, which is what I'd like to consistently do more often. So Ed, we have lots of connections that go back a ways, and they might come up as we have a discussion. I'm interested in, at this point in your very esteemed and experienced career, if you are standing or sitting next to somebody and they say, "Hey, Ed, what do you do?" How do you answer that question?
It's a great question. And, it reminds me of when I decided to go into the field of industrial and organizational psychology. I announced that to my father, who he managed one of the largest Chevrolet dealerships in the country at the time. And it was all business. Dad, I'm going to be an industrial psychologist. What is that? He said. 40 or 50 years later, I'm still trying to figure that out. But honestly, the simple answer is I'm a coach. Sometimes I say I'm a management psychologist, but that just confuses people.
So if you say coach, then they say, okay, Giants, Jets, Mets, Yankees. What is that?
I coach a famous food entrepreneur, Stu Leonard Jr. And one of his employees in the store said to me, "What do you do for Stu?" And I said, "I'm his coach." And she looked at me. She was really perplexed because I didn't think he played soccer.
Absolutely. And, I coached my kids' soccer teams, 4 kids for over 20 years. And then, thank you. I got a hat that said Coach Lipsky, but then it took about like 15 years to figure out that maybe that was my life calling as opposed to just being yelled at by parents.
A great follow-on question, though, to the question that you raise is I tell people, people, as they grow up in responsibility and they move up the chain of command, they get less and less feedback about how they're doing. That's my job, to give people in leadership honest feedback about how they're doing. And people get that right away. They seem to really grab onto that.
Yeah, that seems connected to your secret sauce. Like, what's your secret sauce of coaching?
It's That's a very complex question, because what makes an effective coach is a lot of things that contribute to effective coaching engagements. But at the root, it comes down to self-awareness. It's building self-awareness. It's the key to effective leadership. There's a whole extensive research literature that people who are considered effective leaders, and I have a very conservative definition of that. They're people who build teams that outperform the other people for a long period of time. Not popular always, but more effective. Well, one of the things that we've learned about that is effective leaders, the gap between their self-concept and their public reputation tends to be narrow. So if there was nothing else accomplished in a coaching engagement but to reduce that gap, I take considerable satisfaction in that.
Ed, when did you kind of know that that was your like secret sauce, or really how you approached a coaching engagement?
Well, it wasn't a moment because it was a process, but how I got into all this and how I got into this topic of leadership is a very interesting story. So I attended Bucknell University, and in those days, everyone was in the ROTC, including me, and I did quite well in it. I became a company commander and all that good stuff. Well, the war in Vietnam was on, but I got deferred because I was going to graduate school to get my degree in industrial psychology. The day of my PhD orals, orders arrived for me to go to Vietnam, and the Army in its infinite wisdom wanted me to run a combat post office. And I was ready to do that. I wasn't too excited about it, but it was my duty, right? Well, 3 weeks before shipping out, new orders arrived. It seemed that the Secretary of Defense in those days, a guy by the name of Robert McNamara, wanted a study done. Was the military academy cost-effective in producing career Army officers? That became my job. So instead of going to war, I went to the military academy as a faculty member, setting up this research. And one of the first things we did, we studied with the data we had available, what were the predictors of effective leadership? And the way we got at that, we asked this question: what did we have in terms of measurement that predicted who became a general first? And we looked at things like test scores, officers' ratings, rank in class, and we were shocked to discover that nothing seemed to correlate with who became a general first. But in the third week of Beast Barracks, their freshman year, we asked the freshmen, the plebes, who were the most effective leaders? And I don't remember the number, but it was a correlation of like 0.45 with who became a leader first. And of course, the question was, why? What was it that they were looking at? And this became an obsession of mine, and it has remained one for my whole career. By the way, that study still continues to this day. There's a lot more people working at it than the lonely guy in the headquarters building.
I am fascinated with that because so for my dissertation, I looked at who was rated as a more effective leader and who got paid and promoted more. And the finding was mostly consistent, which is people who networked more, people who influenced more. And then the third one was a little unusual, which is people who invested more in their staff development. Like people that were, I'm interested in how does that relate to what you found?
What I've learned in my experience is there's no more powerful way to build engagement and alignment with an organization than to have the culture be associated with development. We grow talent here. In my years running HR at Pepsi International, we built a brand as well. It was a very internally competitive environment and very challenging in many ways, but boy, did we get good at developing talent. And really, and that brand in the marketplace allowed us to recruit incredible people. And we very, very rarely lost anyone. And if we lost anyone, it's because they became great leaders in other businesses and other organizations, which we were very proud of, By the way, on the topic of the military academy and McNamara's question, here's an interesting, this is a politically sobering lesson for me. So we developed a questionnaire called the Military Career Commitment Index. It was a simple rating. How committed are you to a career in the Army? In freshman year or plebe year, I forget the numbers, but it was in the high 90s. Everybody was committed to a career. By senior year, that had dropped down to something like 15%. I published that and got in so much trouble, it was unbelievable. But I was just a little young and inexperienced in those days, you know.
Love it.
The realistic job preview, never a good idea, right?
Right.
Just results in people saying, heck no.
The best answer to the question, though, one of the great alumni of the military academy is General Stanley McChrystal, a remarkable leader, one of the most effective guys. I didn't always agree with everything he decided or did, but as a leader, he's incredible. He wrote an article to the New York Times just a few weeks ago, how important character was in determining who should run the country. And I didn't want to get into all the political stuff and ramifications of all that, but reflecting on that, we've learned that really the qualities associated with effective leadership really define character. Mm-hmm. And that's the most profound learning of all, I think.
Yeah, I loved his book, A Team of Teams. Very interesting in terms of actually, how do you actually share as much information as possible, maybe onto the border of actually pushing more information than people would necessarily think they would need to know in order for them to connect dots.
And you know, his point that it's certainly important how people in leadership role, their positions on issues. In the political scene, he would say, you know, how you feel about the Palestinian situation or abortion. These are important things. But what's far, far more important, and what you should be really thinking about, is the character of the person and their track record. What is the evidence that they have built teams that outperform the other guy? And if you did nothing else but focus on that question, your batting average in terms of great outcomes would be spectacularly improved. And I completely buy that.
When you're coaching leaders around that, Ed, what would they experience in terms of you highlighting or bringing out that character focus?
Well, the best way to do that, of course, is to talk about examples of success, of people who are effective leaders, and to contrast that with, by the way, one of the most interesting fiascos in the management literature is boards, search firms, and all of us, we fall prey to people who have bravado. The classic narcissistic syndrome, claiming you can do this and I'm going to do that and everything's going to be just great. And you know what? The research is just the opposite. When you look at the research of pundits like Jim Collins, who discovered the importance of humility along with perseverance, right? The difference between being confident and arrogant, and how that. And so when you show leaders examples of leaders who on the good side and bad side, I think it's very, very powerful. Dr. Hogan, the famous personality theorist, has a great article on the subtopic of humility. And he points out examples of great leaders and bad leaders. And one of the bad leaders is Napoleon. And, you know, guys like that. And then he'll go, what's his name? The guy who turned around Ford as a very good leader. Very good. And graphic examples like that they really work.
Yeah, I just also wonder, like, sometimes in some of these leaders, if you would use it as an example, that oftentimes people have a different experience with them. And what I've noticed, using an example of people in the past, like Steve Jobs, some people would say, oh, great leader, as we look back. But at the same time, some people that worked with him in the moment, horrible leader, right? And so sometimes it's just based upon, in my coaching of particular leaders, their view or their experience with leaders is so varied that they can't ever really say, like, oh, consistently that man or woman is incredibly humble, incredibly self-aware because they're part of, I'm sure there's part of their life that's just like, I don't know, not a great leader.
Well, Matt, building on that, I found leaders who have had a profound learning experience during the course of their careers, their stories are very, very powerful to use in coaching. And Steve Jobs may be an example of that, because we've all read and heard about the dark side of Mr. Jobs. But there's a book out called Creativity, Inc. by the founder of Pixar. And the last chapter talks about what life was like with the Steve Jobs that must have matured late in life. It's so different from everything you've seen. It's remarkable. And it reminded me, I once worked for a very brilliant guy named Andy Pearson, who ran Pepsi. He's the president of PepsiCo. Pearson was one of the toughest, most analytical characters you ever want to meet. And there was too much fear in the environment because he was so intimidating. A compliment from him would be, that's not the dumbest bump idea I've ever heard. That would be a compliment, okay? But in his career, he went on to do amazing things with his life. He came to this insight in life that how his dark side had actually impaired him from being as effective as he could have been. And it's very touching and very moving tale. Of course, all the alumni, guys like me, who suffered through all that, I mean, we just cried when we read that, gee, why didn't that happen a little sooner, Andy? Gee whiz.
Yeah. Ed, I do have a question just on this whole idea, because I actually think coaches have a very unique perspective, or get a unique insight into particular leaders. In fact, I've had clients would actually say that to me. Well, you've seen the good and the bad side of these leaders. How do you see that? I just wonder, as a coach, what do you see? Like when you see a leader and you're like, all of their people are telling them they're just the cat's pajamas. They're wonderful, right? Oh, they're just hearing all of these things. But your job is to actually sort of add some self-awareness in that, and maybe even talk a little bit more about the dark side. Say if you were coaching Steve Jobs, you actually see both sides. So this is not a great person, or, this is just a human with good and bad. How does that happen in your coaching?
But the real issue you're raising here is, how does one really give constructive feedback? What is the science behind all that? And there's quite a bit of a literature about that. But one of my favorite techniques, if you will, is remember what we were talking about, the difference between a person's public persona and their self-concept. So I'll just tell you one critical story. I'm coaching a guy at a very large bank who's the number 3 guy. He's on the short list to be the CEO. And the bank is in a lot of trouble, and he's been given an impossible mission to get literally billions of dollars of cost out of the business. And that's why they hired me to coach him, because it's a tough challenge, right? So I go through the usual thing. I interviewed him, I tested him, I did a whole bunch of 360 interviews, and I fell in love with the guy as a talent. But virtually 14 people who I interviewed, senior people in the bank, all agreed he was a micromanager. So I gave this guy this feedback, all his strengths, blah, 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 blah. Started with the strengths, got into the dark side. But this is a problem, buddy. You're a micromanager. And if we don't change that, you ain't going to get promoted, buddy, And he said to me, Ed, I'm not a micromanager. I am saving this bank. Why do you think we're in the trouble we're in? None of these people pay attention to the details. And I had to explain to him, listen, buddy, if the whole world sees you as a micromanager, I don't care if you're a great manager or not, you're not going to get promoted. And boy, did that ring a bell. By the way, he didn't get promoted. Unfortunately, I loved him. He's a wonderful talent in so many ways. And he was probably right.
Yeah. Ed, you had mentioned something, and I'm just going to highlight it because I may save it for my feedback, but you just mentioned the word love. And I think as a coach, we have to love our clients enough to say that to them. Hey, you're a micromanager. And I think that is,
you're making my day.
Yeah.
I've recently finished an engagement. I'll have to keep all this confidential. But one of the giant pharmaceutical companies hired a woman scientist, MD, who's a leading expert in cell therapy and well on the way to find cures for cancer. And she was a recent hire. And the organization she's joining is fairly complex and hierarchical and, big pharma. And she is just the opposite. Hands-on, focused, driving, cut to the quick. I'm trying to cure cancer. Why do I have to go to a meeting, And so working with her for 6 months, I was in love with her because she was so engaging, so committed, and her people were so engaged and committed as a result of it. And here she was, this outlier persona in this large, complex company. And there was risk if we didn't potty train her in certain ways. I mean, there's certain things you got to do to survive, right? At the end of the engagement, I was so enjoying her. At the end of the engagement, she thanked me for making her appreciate who she was. And she felt the affection and respect I had for her. And it gave her so much energy to continue the combat she's into in corporate life. It was fantastic. And I took tremendous satisfaction from it.
That could give you energy for another 5,000 meter bike ride.
That was one of those engagements when we really didn't change her behavior at all. We celebrated it. We reinforced it.
Yeah, it's very interesting how you can go through somebody's strengths to find where to help them, as opposed to holding up the mirror of gloom.
Yes. And then the other thing, we all have strengths and we all have limitations, but those strengths always have a dark side or a potential dark side. And that's another way to give people difficult feedback.
What would you want? Yeah. What would you want from a coach, Ed?
Well, certainly the courage to give honest feedback is of essential importance, but it's not just that, because I think a really good coach in corporate life has to have some awareness of how important the context is, the cultural context. It makes a huge difference. The same profile of characteristics doesn't work in another kind of a culture. I work with some very famous consulting firms. And one, it's the high achiever, competing maniac that wins. And the other one is the only ones who win are the guys who are collegial team players. Well, those are very different places. And so having the insight and appreciation of that, I think is something else I would look for in a coach. I think it's quite valuable. Sometimes I've been successful as a coach, which is a competitive process, because I've successfully built and sold a business, And so I can say commercial sagacity, demonstrated commercial sagacity, that's an asset. I'm not sure that's true, but I've used it and I've been happy I've done it.
Well, if you're obviously adding value, I guess, if you can actually be willing to sort of make the case for the business. So they appreciate that.
If you make the case this way, we were successful in that venture because we built a great team, and that great team outperformed all the other guys, and that's it. That was it. And amazing.
Yeah,
I love it.
Ed, what would you recommend for what are like 3 resources or books? Dave even likes poems that you would recommend for people. Yeah,
one that I would certainly, a classic I think is required reading is Collins' work, Good to Great. I mean, I just think that's for starters. But a more recent book that I've thoroughly enjoyed and I've worked productively with many clients is a book called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. Coyle has studied high-performing teams in virtually every walk of life: business, entertainment, sports, science. And he's derived from that some key learnings about what makes a team truly high-performing, where they hit it out of the park and whatever their domain is. And it's a wonderful read, and an easy read too.
Do you, you know what, you actually, I'm not going to say that this is, but if any of our listeners want to actually there's another book, and Ed has mentioned Bob Hogan, Robert Hogan's book, The Dark Side of Personality, which is
Yes.
another incredible, insightful book. If you've ever done the Hogan, but you haven't purchased a resource, there is a book. It's well worth your money to actually see The Dark Side of Personality by Hogan. And that is
It's a
rich.
great book.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of Dr. Hogan. And I also enjoyed his book, Personality and the Fate of Organizations,
Mm.
which it's an easy read in paperback. And certainly if you're a Hogan user, you need to digest that.
Yeah. Good. Dave, what's your what's your reflection?
My reflection is first, I'd like to say Hogan is absolutely my favorite assessment. And also my father was a car dealer and also asked me what the heck I wanted to do with my life.
No,
A Chrysler dealer in Massachusetts. And it's very interesting how like we have common threads as coaches and we have some challenges. And my reflection is I really appreciate your presence and your strength, because you did coach, you do currently coach, and you coached in very challenging, very tough organizations. And I have a lot of respect for being able to, speak to power and coach to power, which I think requires some different things. And I appreciate you sharing that.
Mm.
I thank you. It's true that it's energy draining and challenging dealing with some of the characters that we have to deal with. But who better than us?
We would have been selling cars if
Exactly.
not.
Well, why not? Why not us? This actually leads me to my reflection, and then I would say, I do believe that coaches play a very significant role in shining light on a leader's character when no one else will point it out. And that demonstration of shining light, I would say, is love, which I care enough about you as a leader that I'm going to say that. And that takes courage. As far as my understanding on the character qualities of a coach, courage and care and concern for the whoever I'm sitting across from. And I've got to be willing to actually say that, because oftentimes some of the leaders don't have other people surrounding them that will have someone saying that. So that's my sort of reflection. I think coaches play that unique role. And the higher in the organization, the more common it is that they're only hearing, you walk on water and your feet don't get wet. So I think that's a unique place to play.
Indeed. And people often underestimate how lonely the gentleman or lady in the corner office is. It's an extremely lonely place and very, very demanding. And to have the support of a colleague and coach that you trust and trust you is sometimes it's the most important. There have been engagements where I've been working with the CEO and I've begun to question, am I really adding value here? Have I really done my job? And yet the person wants to continue it. And you know why? Because it's the only safe partner he has or she has.
Mm.
It's pretty interesting phenomenon,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Mm. Ed, maybe you could share with our audience, what's the best way to get a hold of you? How would someone actually reach out and connect with you?
Anyone would like to reach me, I think email is probably the best way. ed@piccolino.com
Mm.
will work just fine.
Yeah. And so that's two C's and one N.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm not a big user of LinkedIn, and I stay away from Facebook and places like that. But
Yeah.
You can get me that way too, but it's not my favorite.
Yeah. Dave, what are thoughts next?
I think I want to close out by a thank you to our sponsor. Are you feeling stuck or overwhelmed? Character Matters Coaching and Consulting provides leadership coaching and consulting to empower you to overcome obstacles to reach your full potential. Visit charactermatters.com to learn more about their transformative coaching and how to get in touch with Matt for your organization. And character really came up a lot in today's discussion and just in our current environment. And Ed, I really appreciate the people that carry the torch of character. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thanks for the invite, guys. I've enjoyed the dialogue with you so much. Terrific.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for listening. If you love this podcast, please share it with another coach or leader. Make sure you go to the show notes to get all the resources from today's episode.